everyone. Welcome back to the Practical Theism podcast where faith and culture collide. I am back on the podcast with Chad Torgenson today. Chad, welcome back. He is a recurring guest. If you missed episode 1, you definitely want to check it out, all about Ignatian Spirituality. But Chad is an author. He authored the book Waking Up Catholic, A Guide to Catholic Beliefs for Converts, Reverts, and Anyone Becoming Catholic. He's running currently a YouTube channel under the name Directional Faith, so you definitely want to go check him out. But Chad, welcome back to the podcast, man.
Yeah, thanks for having me back. It's first one was a lot of fun, so we had to go for a second one, right?
Yeah, probably a third, a fourth, and all the way down the road until you get sick of me.
Well, you're coming on my channel next, right? I mean, this is the plan.
That's actually right. That is. So you're going to want to head over to Directional Faith, subscribe there, ring that bell, because I'm going to be popping over there. No idea yet what I'm talking about. Chad's going to figure that out.
Probably something practical, right?
Probably, yeah, and something around theism, I'm not sure. But we'll figure that out, and I'll definitely let everybody know when that's happening. So Chad, for those who didn't get a chance to get introduced to you, if you haven't, like I said, go check out episode 1. It's awesome. But for those who haven't gotten familiar with you, today we're actually going to be talking about finding God's purpose for your life, or finding God's will for your life, because Chad, you're a spiritual director. Yeah. So why don't you give everybody the Cliff Notes version of your journey up until this point, and really tell us a little about what led you to being a spiritual director. Tell us a bit about that.
Yeah, so if you saw in the first episode, I was talking a little bit about how I struggled through life a little bit and eventually found my way to Catholicism and went through the journey, became Catholic, went through RCIA. And once you get through that, you think, okay, I've arrived. But really, life is just stages. We always think about, one of my favorite things is people talk about life being a journey. And really, in the end, I see it more of a pilgrimage. Because when you're talking about life being a journey, it's just going from birth to death, and there's really no purpose or point to it. But really, in the end, a pilgrimage is when you're going on a journey, but you have a specific holy place in mind. And for me, so instead of being birth to death, it's birth to heaven. And so what I realized was going through that whole period of life is that I had found Catholicism, but that wasn't it. I needed to figure out, where am I going next? What is my next thing? And at the time, that's what led me to writing Waking Up Catholic. And for a couple of years, that was my focus, was helping people that were new to the Catholic faith learn more about the basics of what we believe. But then life kind of got in the way and started popping out kids. And next thing you know, I don't have the same time to devote to the ministry the way I wanted to. And that call kind of stuck on my life, though. 4, 5, 6, 7 years had gone by, and I was still active in my church and spent time trying to do things in ministry, but I wasn't doing the creative efforts anymore. I wasn't writing, wasn't blogging. And that call just never left. And so using kind of the principles of discernment and the Ignatian spirituality that I love so much, I started trying to figure out, where was God calling me? And one of the ways that God calls us is in a very direct way. And at the time, I knew, what, I need to go back to school. Because when I was a writer before, that was a big roadblock I had. Was everyone said, oh, you don't have the credentials, you don't have the degree behind your name or something to be able to be, a good Catholic writer. So decided I was going to go back to school. I hop online, I go into Google, and I said, all right, I don't want to be a theologian. There's a lot of theologians out there. I want to do something different. And maybe there's something more spirituality focused. So I typed into Google, master's degree in spirituality online. And the first thing that popped up was Loyola University Chicago, which comes on the hat here. And so to get that as a message that here was St. Ignatius again, popping up in my life, saying, here's where you need to go. And when I started going for that program, one of the big things for St. Ignatius is the spiritual exercise, this 30-day retreat that you take, or you can do 30 weeks. And usually when you're doing that, you go through with a spiritual director. So in the program, they offered the spiritual direction certificate that you could get along with your master's degree. And I figured, why not? And here I am. So basically, it was one of those things where it wasn't something I necessarily intended to do. I knew that God was calling me in a direction, and I was open to wherever he was going to lead me. And in the end, it led me to spiritual direction, which now that I'm actually starting to practice it a little bit and meet with clients on a weekly basis, it's been the greatest thing in my life, to where here was this surprise career, this surprise ministry or vocation that God's calling me to, that 6 months before I never would have expected.
That's incredible. So kind of, I want to parlay it over with Directional Faith, your YouTube channel. How did that name manifest itself? Like, where did you come up with the name?
Because I realized that, for one, I wanted to be a spiritual director. So you always think about the idea of direction and where's my faith going and what direction is it taking? So like I said, I see life as this pilgrimage, and that in the end, I don't want to just wander through life. I don't want to just simply stumble into things and find my way the hard way. I want to make sure that I'm following God's will for my life, whatever that may be. And so the whole purpose of Directional Faith is, if you look at the logo of it, which is behind me on the wall, is that road sign, that Christ is that road sign for us. He's the one giving us the direction if we're looking for it, but we need to be paying attention for it.
That's awesome. So as a spiritual director, one of the things I think of when I think of spiritual directors, I'm like, oh, this is a person I could go to and they could tell me which decision to make, which car to buy, which wife to marry. Like, I mean, that's part of being a spiritual director, right? But then I kind of, as I matured in that thought, realized and recognized through some of my conversations with people, Josh, that's not really what a spiritual director is, right? They don't make the decisions for you. So for everybody who might not be aware, maybe they haven't had a spiritual director, had somebody that they look up to from that perspective. What exactly is it that you do with the people that you get the opportunity to work with?
Probably the scene, if you want to set it, a lot of people would think of, mental health counseling and, that setting where you're sitting down, talking with somebody about what's going on in your life, that type of thing. It's very similar to that, but instead of focused on your mental health, you're focused on your spiritual health. And where's your relationship with God right now? The difference is that when you're treating your mental health, you're treating you and you're treating something possibly wrong with you. In spiritual direction, there's nothing really wrong with you, right? We're all on this journey of, ebbs and flows and back and forth. You might be at stronger points of your faith than others, but in the end, it's not about there's being something wrong with you. It's about how can we connect better to God?
Yeah.
How do we build that relationship? And whenever you're in a session, instead of thinking of it's just the two of us talking and having a conversation, I like to say that there's three of us there, that it's me, you, and the Holy Spirit sitting down to have a conversation. But really, I'm the mediator. You're not talking to me. You're not trying to find how to have a better relationship with me. My goal is to help guide you through to, your own thoughts and your own ideas of how do you better connect to the Holy Spirit and then obviously to Jesus through him.
Yeah. So what are some of the ways that you do that with somebody who maybe is coming to you and they're looking for advice? I know often if I'm like struggling with something, I usually go to talk to somebody and I'm like, give me some advice on what to do, but I think that kind of defeats the purpose if I'm not mistaken. So is it just a lot of question asking, or what's your process typically?
And that can vary from spiritual directors. I'd have to say most spiritual directors take what they call a reflective listening approach. So a lot of the spiritual directors you meet with will ask you a lot of questions to where if you open up about what's going on in your spiritual life, maybe your prayer life, and you'll be talking about, my relationship with God doesn't feel that strong right now. And they'll ask a question about, well, are you praying daily? Or how do you feel your prayer life is going right now? And just ask a question about it that will get you to talk more. The end goal of that is obviously to help you find the answer on your own. And for a lot of people, I think that's a perfectly fine way to do it. And I'd say about half of what I do is that method. At the same time, I'm also a little more old school, where I don't believe it's wrong to actually be a little more directive. Where some people will come to me and they want advice. Yeah. They don't want just questions asked of them. They want practical, real advice. And I'm not going to tell them what decision to make in their life, or should you marry this girl or take that job. It's more about, I'm going to give them the tools and actual practical ways to discern that for themselves. So I'm not giving them the answer, but I'm going to help them find the ways to get to the answer.
Yeah. It's funny when I first, I'm not a spiritual director by any stretch. I guess in some ways I am in some areas of life, but not by trade or profession. And it's a funny story. When I when my wife and I were like early in our married years, I'd be like, okay, I'm not gonna voice my opinion. I'm gonna ask questions here, right? And then she would get so annoyed with me about asking questions. She's like, "What? Just tell me what you want to say. What are you trying to say? Like, what do you want me to figure out?" You know. So I learned then. I was like, okay, it isn't just about like you can't just ask. You're going to question people to death. They're going to get really irritated with it. So everybody doesn't need that approach. We're talking about like finding God's will or God's purpose for your life too in this episode. Just short, direct answer. Do you believe everybody has a purpose, or rather, a reason why they exist?
Yeah, and I think it's actually simpler than what people think. A lot of times when people think of what is God's will for my life, it's, do I become a musician, a pastor, or a priest? Do I take this job? Do I marry this person? And, what is this purpose for my life? What am I supposed to become? St. Ignatius lays out this idea that we all have one purpose, and it's the same purpose. And it's to praise, reverence, and serve God. Mm-hmm. Everything else we do, from what job we have to what vocation we serve in, how we help the church, what do we do with our free time, is all towards that goal. So that we don't have to think about what is my career going to be or what is my vocation. Really, it's which ways can I serve God? Which ways can I praise and reverence him the best? And if you keep everything in that focus, the rest of it starts to not matter as much.
Yeah, I love that. You have kids, Chad, right?
Yep.
How many kids do you have, by the way?
4.
4 kids.
Yeah.
Awesome. Have you guys watched the recent Pixar movie, The Soul?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, and it was, a bit intimidating to answer some of those questions with the kids afterwards that, talked about some really deep subjects for the kids, and they're like, Daddy. Oh, I was not ready for that.
Yeah, it was I didn't think about, because I was thinking of Inside Out, right? And I was kind of going to compare it to that, but it was totally different. And my kids liked Inside Out. I was like, I wonder if this is pretty deep for them to think about. But one of the interesting things I found in the movie is they depict this idea, right? As they would say that the sparks people have in their lives are these points of inspiration. They're not to be confused with the purpose of a soul.
Right.
And I found it a really interesting thing that seemed pretty applicable to this conversation of like, well, is there something, you often hear people say, I was made to do this. Or I am made this is what I was made for, and that's all they can think about. That's all they go out and do, especially in younger years. What do you make of it? Do all souls have a purpose in that specific? Meaning, I know you mentioned Ignatius and doing to love, serve God but is there a vocation, a thing that you were made to do, and that should be like what your relentless pursuit is after? I'm just kind of curious what you make of that as a spiritual director.
I actually, one of the great parts about that movie is not to give any spoilers for anyone that hasn't seen it yet, but the fact that once he finally attained his goal, it didn't give him the joy that he thought it was, that it didn't really give him that sense of satisfaction. All of a sudden he reached that goal and he felt just as empty as he did the day before. And we've probably all felt that way at times, to where you've got some big goal in your life and you finally get there and you celebrate it for 2.5 minutes. And then you move right on to the next thing and realize, okay, what now? And I think that's really the thing, is that when we set these earthly goals, we're going to get earthly joy out of it. It's a temporary, fleeting thing. We can't put our stock into it. And that's why, to me, letting go of some of that and realizing that, God's going to call us to a lot of different things throughout life. If you look at my life, there was a period where I spent time in the military. I felt called to that. There was time that I was called to be a writer and help people go through RCIA. I did that for a few years and helped a lot of people. But then I was called to spend time and really focus on my family. Much to my chagrin, part of me wanted to stay with, ministry and to keep moving forward with it. But I knew that God was calling me to stay home for a while and to help take care of what we needed to here. And once I got a little bit older, now I felt God calling me again. And so I don't think that I was lost for those 7 years. I think that was God preparing me for what I needed to have in order to start this next phase of my journey.
Yeah. Yeah, I love how you put that too. I feel this a similar tone, when it comes to, I look at my own journey. It's not like you go in all these paths and you're trying to step through all these doors, and that's an active participation you're trying to take in the life, identifying the direction God has, and it changes to you. It doesn't change to God. God knows the direction that you're going, right? But it changes to you. And you do things you never thought you would. For example, a good example of this for me in my own life is there was a time when I was in college, and I would go out and audition for things. I really enjoyed the theater, and so I did a few theater shows. And I was a business major. That was my plan B, right? And so I tried to do little acting, auditioning things here and there. And there was a part of me that was like, I'm different. I'm meant to be, this is what I know this is, and it just never panned itself out, right? Never panned itself out. And this is years ago. And hindsight's 2020, but you see what God was doing in those moments. And it's not, you don't have to feel bad about your past and that something didn't work out the way you thought it would.
Right.
But I look at where I'm at now, and how incredible God's steps were ordered at how he laid things out. Well, going out for all those auditions taught me something about self-confidence, and going out in these auditions taught me something about how to present myself. And acting classes, for example, taught me how to be comfortable on camera. Oh, and by the way, it actually prompted me in the audition process I got this inkling to say, don't wait for the audition, go start shooting your own stuff. So what did it do? Put me behind the camera. I started to learn AV stuff. And before you know it, I got a podcast called Practical Theism, right? And so all of these talents that he was shaping me for led me to something else that is now hopefully being used for his purposes, right? And so it's just, I look at that in hindsight always as kind of an example. You don't have to be ashamed of all the failures that you had in the past. You're going to have failures, but if you look at those failures as really just kind of stepping stones to the direction God is having you go in, and recognize too, I heard this put the other day, the goal isn't the goal for the goal's sake, right? The goal isn't about the goal. The goal is about the person you become trying to attain the goal. Oh, and nice. And I love that. I thought that was so pointed and powerful when it comes to seeking out your purpose or what you're intended to do here on earth,
Well, yeah, and it's, I love that you brought that up, that idea of, that was really your practical education, was it not? To be able to go through these things in life and gain all those tools along the way that you're going to use now, which even now, if you were to say, hey, this is what God is calling me to do, it was, right? That this was part of the process that back then you wouldn't have seen. And even if God had tried to tell you what his plan was back then, you wouldn't have believed him and you would have thought he's crazy. So you kind of needed to go through this journey and take these steps to get to where you're at right now. You're exactly where you're supposed to be. And that's kind of the truth of the matter, is that we may wander through life, but God knows where we're going to end up. And, it's all part of the process of him molding us, through these different experiences.
You're totally right. So from your perspective, Chad, how does one live out their purpose in life?
I think by being authentic to themselves and being true to those desires that God is putting on our hearts. And, I mentioned earlier about, that there's desires that can either lead us to the worldly things, kind of like, we're stuck on, hey, I want to be an actor. I want to go into, be in Hollywood or maybe be on a stage in New York, and you've got that worldly goal for it. But whereas, God puts that desire in your heart for, having that stage presence and that charisma, he's giving you that gift and that talent. But he's not calling you to use it over there. He's calling you to use it over here instead, and to start a ministry and to, work with people on YouTube and guide souls that way. That there's so many greater purposes to the things that he brings us through each day. Yeah.
I don't think, I thought about this one time too. I was like, well, if, let's say that did pan out. Let's think about the alternative. Let's say I had this goal to be in theater or be on film or whatever from an acting perspective. Let's say that was the direction that he wanted me to go. And I always say that God didn't put me in that world because I couldn't handle it at that time. But if that was the direction that he wanted me to go, it isn't necessarily a ministry ordered direction, right? But it's something where and who knows where I'd be if I was involved in the industry as a whole, and how strong my faith would be. But the very fact that I wasn't, I settled down with my wife, and we went through our spiritual journeys together and having kids and stuff. And that was really what launched me on a deeper level spiritual journey. But not everybody, I guess, goes to that deeper level, or and this isn't to toot my own horn or tout anything that I'm doing, but it's just recognizing that some people are so resistant to God calling to use their talents and live their life out for specifically ministry purposes.
Right.
Or maybe it's this idea of ministry that they have in their mind of like, oh, ministry is going out and holding signs on the side of the road or whatever it might be. They don't recognize that there's little things you can do that are ministry in and of themselves to live out this principle of loving God, and living out your identity as a child of God, and one that's created from and for love, right?
Well, I think that's perfect, to where everyone thinks that, if God's calling you and whatever your purpose for is in life, they think that if they're not becoming a priest or a nun or taking some vow of poverty, that they're not fulfilling God's will for their life. And not everybody's going to be called to that. That's simply not the case. And even someone like you or I, where we've got this passion for ministry, and I'm sure both of us would love to say, hey, I get to do this YouTube thing full time. But the reality is that may not be the case for either one of us. But we're still in love with the ministry and still in love with reaching out to people. We hold a day job, we do our thing, and we do this on the side, and we're still using our talents and our gifts to further the kingdom, whether we eventually get to do it full time or not. And some people will never be called to that. And maybe the gifts and talents that you have might not put you there anyways. That some people might be called to work in, let's say as a police officer. You might not see that as a ministry of sorts, but if you can't see how protecting the people and protecting the public around you is not God's will, I mean, what else is there? So, I really think that we have to change our frame of mind and realize that, God's will for our life doesn't always have to be some holy adventure. I mean, in a lot of ways, yes, we do want to serve God, whether it's full time or we just volunteer some of our time. But serving God is really in our everyday life. And that's where the Ignatian spirituality comes in, that you don't have to, like I said, give up everything, be like St. Francis and go running naked through the streets. You can serve God in your life right now with what you're doing.
Yeah. I want to ask you this. One of the things I think a lot about, and something I've kind of come to the conclusion of, is that we as just kind of society, human society as a whole, we have a bit of an identity crisis, is what I would dub it. Like we don't know who we are and where we come from. And what that leads to is a lot of, we're on a search to understand that question. Who am I and where do I come from? What's my purpose in life? And so we start seeking that out in a wide variety of different areas. Some of it might be trying different things in this world, and some of it might lead to certain addictions. But some of it might be, we're trying to take something that in this world that's good, and we're making it that ultimate good, right? The thing that gives us purpose and that which doesn't always feed us in the long term. Like you mentioned, you get that one gig that your life was made for this gig, and all of a sudden you feel empty afterwards. And so I think about too, when you understand your identity specifically in Christ and in God, who is love, you recognize, well, if this creator that is love created me for my own good, that means I was created by love, God, for love, because that nature is now on my heart. Yeah. And that's part of who I am. It's my default position, but we've kind of gone wayward from that. So if everybody gets back to this default position, well, then we would just be one big blob of love. This is kind of how my brain works. So you're getting an inside scoop. But I'm curious, we know that's not the case. And the saints are a very clear depiction of the fact that that's not the case. You don't just have a bunch of gray matter that people just all think and operate and move the same way. They still have these uniquenesses to that. So from a spiritual director standpoint, how do unique traits, talents, and personalities, how do those fit into this overall purpose that Ignatius of Loyola laid out, as you mentioned earlier?
Yeah, one of the things that I try to do is help everybody find their unique purpose and place in life, and realizing that it's a growing process. I just spoke with a woman a few weeks ago that she was going through this stage in life to where, God seemed to be calling her in one direction, and she was feeling this sense of community and wanting to belong. And in the end, she wasn't feeling like she had that at the parish that she was at. And when she decided to go ahead and move on, right, she felt a lot better. Well, then she lost that feeling and started to go back to other feelings in her life to where she felt God calling her in different directions. And so there's this question of, is there a part of her life that, maybe did she have it wrong? Why was God calling her to one thing 3 months ago and something different now? No, it was part of her evolution. God was calling her at a specific moment to get her to that next waypoint on her journey, right?
Yeah.
That when you're kind of going through this, imagine if you're going to drive to Chicago to LA, you're not going to drive straight through. You're going to stop at Kansas City and Denver and a few places along the way. And so I think each one of these moments of our life is God leading us to that next moment, right? That next place for us to take a break and start the next part of our journey. So really that's unique to every person. And if I were to ask 3 different people how to get from Chicago to LA, they'd all give me 3 different answers. One's going to give me the fastest way, the easiest way to get there. Another one's going to give me the most direct way, the fewest amount of turns, just straight shot. And then the last person is going to give me the scenic drive. Here's how you get there and get all the beautiful scenery at the same time. In the end, you're still getting to that same destination. We're all aiming for that same goal of getting to heaven. We just have different ways of getting there.
Yeah, that's awesome. The something that you said just kind of made me think back to this loss of identity that we have. We oftentimes, we look for it, this validation of our identity in other people, and it leads to this comparison mentality, right? That's what you have. That's what's the problem with social media. If you saw The Social Dilemma, it's one of the big challenges with such an internet-based social world. I always say this: the more we've never been more connected with each other, yet been so disconnected with each other. We're so connected in with people's lives on social media, but then we're disconnected from reality because we don't know how to interact and interface with people. We've lost our ability to communicate. And so we look for our identity and our reason, our purpose for living in the lives of others, and without just recognizing what the path is before us. And I think that's part of the traits, talents, personalities that God's blessed you with. He's put you in a specific place at a specific time. I was born in 1987, not in 1687, not in 887, 1987, right? And there was a specific purpose. I was born in that time. And part of that journey is okay, well, what am I intended to do here? Was taking everything that God's laid before you, and now how do you live that out under the understanding of your identity of love in God's love, right? And loving others is, more than yourself. And so I think we lose ourselves in that a little bit, because you see it even, I think C.S. Lewis put it this way: you can't take somebody who grew up in the slums and compare them to somebody who grew up in the burbs, right? Yeah. In so many words, paraphrasing. But the point being, people were placed and grown up in different areas, and he was talking about it in terms of judging each other and judging one another. So you can't judge and gauge your purpose, and it just made me think that you can't judge and gauge your purpose in life and whether or not you're fulfilling it based on what you see someone else doing and whether or not you think or they are or are not fulfilling their purpose in life, if that makes sense.
Oh, yeah. Well, and really along those lines, when you really look at the struggles you go through in life, the suffering that you face sometimes. Don't know the exact quote, but Ignatius once said that, if you've gone through a lot of suffering, be prepared, because God's got big plans for you. That when you really look at the people that have made a difference in the world, they didn't have perfect lives. They didn't come from this cookie cutter suburban life with the white picket fence, which, I guess I'm living now myself, but they didn't come from that. And it was through the struggles and the trials of life that they went through where they really grew and developed and became the awesome, saints and inspiring people that we know today. That, people like Martin Luther King, and the struggles that he faced is what made him the great man that he was. And so I think that we need to really keep that in mind to say, it doesn't matter what things we face or what challenges we've had and what failings like you said, what failings we've had. That's okay. That's part of the learning process. That's what's going to get us to that next level. And, if failing is a mark of how successful you're going to be, I'm going to be, nothing's going to stop me. Right. So I'm way up there, but
let me roll out the rap sheet of all my failures. So Chad, kind of rounding it out on the other side of the spectrum, where do you think people get most confused about their purpose?
That's a good one. A lot of times I think that trying to figure out what is God's will for the life versus their will. I mean, it's really confusing that you're trying to, especially when you're stuck between two good things, to where you're spending time where maybe God is calling you to, example would be calling you to priesthood or calling you to marriage. Those are both two good things. There's, people might elevate priesthood and say, oh, well, that's the holier thing. Not really. They're both sacraments, right? Yeah. So those are both good decisions to make. And as you're trying to discern them, trying to figure out what is God calling me to, like I said, people might, initially say, oh, well, he's calling me to the priesthood because, well, that's the holier thing to do, so I should do that. Not necessarily. That might not be where he's calling you. And so I think really spending time to focus on, what is God's will in all of it? And that's where Ignatian Spirituality, the discernment of spirits comes in, where you can spend time learning how to hear God a little bit better instead of listening to all your own noise going on in your brain.
Yeah, I love that. Well, Chad, this has been awesome, man. Really, really insightful. As we kind of close this piece out, what would you say to somebody who maybe has never sought spiritual direction, never had a spiritual director, never even maybe thought about this idea of spiritual director, and maybe they're struggling with the things that we talked about today, right? Where it's, I have these decisions that are vying for my attention, my time, and I just have no idea which direction I'm supposed to go. What advice would you give that person in terms of taking that first step towards that discernment process?
Obviously the first step is taking the step. That we're so focused on, the things that will hold us back, but eventually you just have to take that plunge. And when you really look at it, you might say to yourself, well, I'm not really a holy person. I don't need a spiritual director. Well, that's why you need a spiritual director. At the same time, most of the great saints that if you read a lot of books, for instance, St. John of the Cross was St. Teresa of Avila's spiritual director, right? That people throughout history in the church have used spiritual directors. And there was a reason for it. And it's because of the fact that this is a tough journey, right? I talked about this idea of pilgrimage. Trying to get to that final destination is not an easy thing. And trying to do it alone is nearly impossible. So having somebody that has a unique perspective to give you, somebody that's trained in it, that will help you develop and understand your faith a little bit better, doesn't have all the biases that your best friend does when you're trying to talk about your faith, and being able to open up in a safe space to be able to share whatever is going on in your heart. And I think that's the biggest thing is people want to know that it's safe and there's complete anonymity. Everything is, completely secure. Nothing leaves the room kind of idea. I don't speak about, even with my wife, what's going on and it was my spiritual direction client. So that's the big thing to know is that you're going to a safe space and like you would with a mental health professional that you can open up and not be afraid that, your life is going to get spilled.
Awesome. Chad, this is awesome. I appreciate the conversation. Appreciate your insights so much. Where can people find out more about you and everything you're doing?
Yeah. So if you want to find out more about, my YouTube ministry as well as spiritual direction, go to directionalfaith.com. There's a whole page there on both of those topics that really dives deep into what Ignatian spirituality is, and then obviously what are the benefits of spiritual direction. So check that out, and I'll see you over on my channel.
Awesome. Well, Chad, I appreciate your time. You've been so generous with it. We'll definitely look forward to being on your channel for the next one and having you back at some point in the future. So thank you so much.
And make sure everybody subscribe over to Practical Theism. If you haven't already, you need to be here. I'll see you in the next video.
That's what we're going to say. If you haven't already, hit that like button and pound that subscribe button like you mean it so you can continue to get more of this awesome content. Ring that bell so you get notifications. And if you're listening on a podcast platform like iTunes, drop a review down below. Let us know how you're liking the podcast. And definitely drop some comments below if you're on YouTube. We'd love to engage the conversation and get the conversation started. It always goes down in the contents. From all of us here at Practical Theism, we'll talk to y'all soon.